In this final installment of our Let's Read project, I will address a number of themes that emerge from The Gambler. Part of the interest in the novella lies with its setting. A great deal of it concerns its characters and the complicated relations between them, and at the center of it is the portrayal of the gambling phenomenon itself, and how that activity relates to the human condition. I'll begin with the setting. Roulettenberg, as a tourist destination for travelers from Europe as a whole, is a kind of Babel, displaying a vast array of nationalities, languages, and currencies, obsessed by affairs of wealth and status, and layered with deceit. As Alexey Ivanovitch describes the general gambling scene in Chapter 2, the lower-class gamblers are perfectly transparent in their single-minded obsession with winning, whereas the aristocrats are more interested in putting on a good show, of displaying an indifference to whether they win or lose, and thus revealing to the onlookers their supposed financial security. For these upper classes, it is all a game of smoke and mirrors, and every bit as materially interested as it is for the grubbers beneath their station. Fortunes and reputations are won or lost by what happens in Roulettenberg, and not always at the roulette wheel. And the Oberkellners are keen on keeping score, renting out rooms according to perceived status. The whole scene coheres with the distaste for Western Europe that Dostoevsky had already articulated in his winter notes on summer impressions in 1863. The climax of that prior work was the author's horror at the Crystal Palace of London, which he took to be mankind's attempt to create a material heaven on earth, forsaking all the spiritual elements of us that make us human. Roulettenberg is no heaven on earth, but its defining feature is the mad dash for material gain which drives all its inhabitants, and which Dostoevsky associates with Western Europe generally. In fact, he appears to be happy to engage in national stereotyping, and we may wonder whether he is being fair. The worst treatment probably is doled out to the Poles, who are here portrayed as a pack of braying hyenas scavenging off others' winnings. That the Poles should be abused so badly here is of interest, since Dostoevsky's closest interaction with Polish people came in the prison camp, where the Polish prisoners may well have saved his life. The French, too, get negative treatment, depicted here as manipulative, deceptive, advanced in etiquette while atrophied in virtue, even if the disapproval is slightly softened down the stretch in Blanche's case. The lone Englishman of the novella is, of course, the foil of the French, clumsy perhaps in the social scene, while solidly decent throughout, principled, virtuous, and sensible. Mr. Astley is the novella's sole reliable voice of reason. Germans make little impression on the plot proper, yet they too come in for critique in Alexey Ivanovitch's ironical tirade to the assembled party at the dinner table in Chapter 4. The German scrimps and saves through a lifetime of honest labor, living in squalor, so that his offspring can build upon the paltry family wealth and pass down better things to another generation, all so that, decades later, a self-important Burmerhelm can stride along the avenue in his finery, which was earned on the backs of his ancestors' toil. Over and against this national trope is the foil of the Germans, which is, of course, the Russian character, or at any rate that of the Russian abroad. That these Russians are abroad, wallowing in this Babel, is perhaps an indication that they have lost their way. During his criticism of Russians in the final chapter, Mr. Astley is careful to exempt the Russian peasantry from his censure, as though the simple life in the provinces of Russia is an admirable thing. But these Russians are far removed from all that, and of these wayward souls our narrator exclaims that, quote, "Roulette is simply made for Russians," unquote. Indeed, all four of the principal Russians on this stage are gamblers in their own way. The most obvious first confirming instance of this comes with Granny, and then secondly with our narrator, whose gambling appears to be a multi-layered affair. But the general and his stepdaughter are gamblers too. The general is placing absurd bets on his chances of romantic bliss with Blanche, and throwing away his family's inheritance, while Polina gambles first on Degrue and then on Alexey Ivanovitch. She confesses to playing for high stakes when she surprises the narrator in his hotel room. "If I come," she says, "I come altogether. That is my way," unquote. All four gamblers wind up losing, with differing prospects for rehabilitation. The best case is Granny's, ending with her returning to Russia a wiser woman, where she builds a church and lives piously until the end of her days. The contrast here is with the general, who remains in Europe with an enfeebled mind, capable only of the kind of happiness available to the well-kept cuckolded dotard. The younger pair are also on opposite paths. Polina ends the novel on a slow road to recovery under the care of the Astley family, while Alexey Ivanovitch is on the road to perdition in the European wasteland. These two younger characters, of course, form the primary relational axis of the novella, and it is a fascinating and complicated dynamic. We do not really have the opportunity to enter the mind of Polina until the end of the episode in Roulettenberg, where her backstory is made plain. Until that time, we are confined to the perspective of Alexey Ivanovitch, and it becomes clear in the story's final stages that the narrator has not understood this young woman at all. The reader then must put the pieces together on his or her own. We learn at the end of the novella that Polina has been cruelly treated by Degrue, seduced in part for the joy of the dalliance, and in part for the promise of financial gain. Polina gives an emotional explanation of her error in Chapter 14, before our narrator provides a more sober analysis in the final chapter. Indeed, his account in Chapter 17 may be the only reliable explanation he provides of Polina's perspective throughout the book. Polina, inexperienced as she was, mistook the polished form of the Frenchman for substance, when the substance was entirely lacking. But then, in falling for Degrue, she placed herself entirely in his power, and thus was forced to endure his insults, all while watching her stepfather throw the entire family into financial turmoil. This is where Polina is situated at the beginning of the novella, although Alexey Ivanovitch is unable to recognize it. And there is another element throughout as well, to which our narrator is entirely blind until that climactic moment. Polina loves him. That she should love him is not a surprise. He is of an age with her, a part of the family orbit, very intelligent, and capable of seeing two things that torment her: the foolishness of the general and the wickedness of Degrue. More, he is fearless, challenging both the general and Degrue to their faces, in public, even at a dinner where he is not invited. For a young woman in desperate need of an ally, Alexey Ivanovitch appears to make a very attractive one. But in the opening stages, Alexey Ivanovitch cannot see this. He imagines that he is nothing but a slave in Polina's eyes, that when she confides in him that she is doing so simply because he is irrelevant to her, and that when she withholds information it is simply to torture him. In fact, she must be circumspect about what she reveals because of the sensitivity of the relevant details, and she confides in him because she loves him and needs a confidant. But she is cold to him. Her behavior appears to be explained by two features. One is her proud disposition. Perhaps the most reliable articulation of her character comes from the clear-eyed granny before her departure. She is described there as a clever wench, and as a wasp who can sting to hurt, but also as a good-hearted person whom Granny loves dearly. The other feature is Alexey's own strange behavior toward Polina. He attempts to pry into her affairs with probing questions, and there is an obvious edge of jealousy when he does so. As early as Chapter 5, he is offering to let her borrow money from him if he wins at roulette, and this notion of taking money from a man she loves will be a sensitive topic to her. And he insists throughout his interrogation of her that she thinks of him as a slave. She despises that notion, but Alexey persists. With Alexey Ivanovitch forcing the conversation in that direction, a proud woman like Polina will respond in haughty style, and this just reinforces our narrator's misconceptions. Naturally, this dynamic invites questions about why Alexey Ivanovitch should behave in this way. The man appears to suffer from a deep-seated insecurity. All of his explosive interactions with the general and de Grue can be partially explained by his desire for respect. His station is that of a tutor, and he assumes that it is a degrading position, and is thought to be so by other people. Indeed, both de Grue and Blanche do hold him as beneath them, and Blanche even confesses to this fact in the penultimate chapter, where she finally learns to appreciate him in her own fashion. But Alexey also assumes that Polina thinks of him in that way, that his lack of status will make him a non-entity in her eyes, and that he must earn her respect through material means. Indeed, that idea seems to persist all the way to the final paragraph of the novella, where he seems to believe that he needs to get back on his feet through gambling in order to enter Polina's presence. He has it entirely wrong. When Polina enters his hotel room, she reveals her love for him, not his status. But it is at that critical moment, when she comes to him, that he is seized by his idea that he could win at gambling, and he pursues status, some way of earning that love, over the woman herself. Hours later, when he gives her the money, Polina recognizes the gesture as an insult, that her affection is to be purchased, not received. The cynicism of the arrangement ultimately poisons everything. Even in the novel's later stages, Alexey Ivanovitch still seems not to recognize this. His reaction to Polina's departure is to defend himself, and he is writing his self-justification in Chapter 15 over a month after the event itself, while he is leaving Paris. In the opening chapter, we learn that throughout his stay in Roulettenberg, Alexey would ask the question, "Do I love her?" My own view is that the answer to that question is no. Alexey does not love Polina. Sex with Polina is a matter of conquest, not love-making. We see this in the very architecture of his fantasies as revealed in Chapter 11. His desire that Polina should come to him with ardent passion, declaring, "I love you," thus choosing him over other rivals. It is self-affirmation that he wants. That drive is, of course, at the root of the young man's gambling. His first reaction to the gambling hall in Chapter 2 is of interest. He finds it all to be dirty and avaricious, but despises the hypocrisy of the moralizers who frown upon it, as indeed it is just another form of making money, and the capitalist endeavor in general is dirty by its nature. Further, unlike the skinflint Germans, who carefully pursue their wealth with self-sacrifice and discipline, the Russian love of life is too great to be contained. Roulette thus is endowed with a perverse kind of honor. Such, at any rate, is his vocal position in Chapter 4. It appears to remain his position in the novella's final pages. The reader, I think, gets a clearer view in the interim. The giveaway comes in that climactic moment, where, with the ice finally broken between Polina and himself, Alexey decides that the real consummation must come at the gaming tables, not with Polina. The following scene at the casino really does have the aura of an orgy, although it is not the release of sexual tension, but of something else. The pent-up frustration of being the mere ushitel, of having filthy de Grues or snotty Burmerhelms looking down on him, of receiving lectures from an idiot general, of poor ratings and poor lodgings from the Oberkellner, and so on. The stated excuse for his gambling bender is the opportunity to give Polina the capital to wipe out de Grues' insult. But we know better. During his play, he forgets about her entirely. Can I really have loved Polina so strangely? He asks himself after everything blows up in Chapter 15. Indeed he does, if it can be called love at all. He is most forthcoming about his addiction in the final, tragic chapter. What he really wanted, he acknowledges, was that all these self-righteous, self-important aristocrats, quote, might all be talking about me, admiring me, praising me, and doing homage to my new success, unquote. He thinks that this daring verve at the gambling tables might make a new man of him, pull him up out of the mire, and that this step is needed for him to be able to face Polina again. In their final conversation, Mr. Astley claims that, if Alexey Ivanovitch were informed that Polina still loves him, he would remain a gambler. He is right. Alexey is unable to receive Polina's love, and still thinks that he must earn it by improving his social status. And in his monomania, he can only imagine one way to do so. All this will seem outrageously irrational to many a reader, at any rate for readers who have never struggled with addiction. It is not, however, the first time Dostoevsky had written about this kind of behavior. In his semi-autobiographical memoirs, The House of the Dead, he offers a detailed account of how the prison convicts in Siberia would act toward smuggled vodka. The convict would scrimp and save for months or years via his clandestine business, gathering up his store of contraband, all so that for one day he could blow it all on heavily watered-down vodka from a crooked smuggler, and a wild time. The next morning he would wake up with nothing but a headache, and would resolutely start the whole process over again. What was it all for? Dostoevsky's answer, the illusion of freedom, if only for a day. Something similar seems to be happening with Alexey Ivanovitch. From the get-go, in Chapter 4, he is describing his risk-taking as defying fate. His spectacular binge in Chapter 14 is portrayed at one moment as free fall, as from a hot air balloon, and the image of leaping from the Schlangenberg is, of course, a running motif. This is not the tedious, methodical toil of the German, working within very narrowly defined rules through self-sacrifice. It is a daring defiance of those rules, the ego straining at the cords that bind it. Clearly, Alexey Ivanovitch longs for his own freedom and the feeling of dignity that comes with it. The conflict that he stokes with the general over the Burmerhelm affair originates with his claim that the general preempted his free decision to act on his own behalf. And in the final stages, he holds that with the combination of willpower and daring, pulling himself up by his own bootstraps, he can overcome all the challenges that face him and, as he puts it, become a man again. But of course he is wrong, and the reader knows it. Alexey Ivanovitch does not have real freedom, but some sort of illusion, the kind of thing the prisoner has while guzzling watered-down vodka in the Siberian prison camp. If there could be salvation here, through love perhaps, our narrator is incapable of receiving it. His ego stands in the way. In this sense, Alexey Ivanovitch is not unlike the underground man, who suffers from much the same problem, even if they are rather different individuals in other respects. Perhaps our author himself struggled with this problem. As noted in my introductory comments, he did himself suffer mightily from a gambling addiction, so when he writes about the gambler's instincts, he writes from experience. The theme of the ego's struggle against Christ-like love had first been scribbled into his notebook 2 years earlier during an intensely personal time, as he sat by his first wife's deathbed in 1864. This idea would form a critical thematic axis for the full arc of his mature work. We think of that work as dominated by 4 great full-length novels: Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Possessed, or Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov. After writing The Gambler, narrowly meeting his publication deadline, Dostoevsky would put the finishing touches on Crime and Punishment, and then embark upon developing the plot and themes of The Idiot. We can see echoes of The Gambler in some of the characters in The Idiot. Polina comes across as a rough prototype for Nastasia Filipovna. Alexey Ivanovitch's oscillation between feelings of love and hatred for Polina will sound like the murderous jealousy of Rogojin. And both General and Madame Bepanchin from The Idiot will have similarities to both the General and Granny from The Gambler. This channel will not pursue The Idiot next, nor indeed any of the great full-length novels. If you have followed the progress of this channel, you have seen that it has so far traced the development of Dostoevsky's work in chronological order. Since Crime and Punishment and The Gambler were published roughly contemporaneously, I opted for the shorter work first. Looking to the future, rather than resuming my chronological march, I think my time would be better invested in continuing with the shorter works next: the novella The Eternal Husband, and then 3 further short stories. After these, I might opt to pursue a less celebrated full-length novel in honor of a special request I have received: The Adolescent, or A Raw Youth. At some point I might just return to those lengthy, great works while measuring the depth of my ambition. But the current project is at an end. Per usual, if you believe these comments to be inaccurate or incomplete, please feel free to improve upon them in the comments section below. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.